Prologue. Every person has a price, but the truly fortunate among us find the ones who can be bought with a simple piece of paper. I turned the photograph over in my hands, feeling the gloss beneath my thumb. The black and white image is clear despite the deep shadows of the thatched roof, but the bright flash off their faces highlights the intimacy of the scene behind, the double bed lit by the paraffin lantern hanging from a nail. The rugged charter pilot smiles, as if he can't believe it's all happening, and the dark-haired girl in her smart cashmere twin suit and pearls smiles up at him, her hand resting on his chest like a devoted bride. Philippa Tremain, the district commissioner's precious, pampered daughter. Cape Town University's rag queen who thinks the world was created solely for her amusement. She thinks she's clever. She thinks a little mountain scandal, buried at the base of the Maluti Mountains, is just a thrilling secret to whisper to her varsity friends over gin and tonics in Cape Town. She has no idea that her foolish little lie is the slip-up that will pave my way to riches. Her father, the high and mighty district commissioner, has been sniffing around my operations in the Highlands for 6 months, playing the untarnished servant of the crown. He thinks he can dismantle a diamond syndicate that has taken me years to build. He thinks his daughter is safe in her ivory tower, courted by Cape Town royalty. He doesn't know about this photograph, not yet. If Tremain keeps pushing his investigation into the Letseng-la-Terai diggings, this picture finds its way to the Myburgh family's breakfast table. One glimpse of their prospective daughter-in-law playing house in a remote rondavel with a disgraced, rough-around-the-edges English pilot, and the glittering Myburgh dynasty will drop her like a hot coal. It will ruin her, break her father's spirit, and destroy the pilot's freedom in one elegant stroke. I slipped the photograph into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket, right next to my cigarette case. Let the girl have her parties in Cape Town for a little longer. Let her dream of diamonds and high society weddings, because very soon I'm going to call in her debt, and when I do, the district commissioner will burn his own files to save her.
Cape Town, 1961. It's nearly 6, for goodness sake. Where is Matthew? Philippa, still dressed only in her cream silk slip, leaned into the cool evening air of the top-floor dormitory window and scanned the driveway leading up to Cape Town University's women's residence. Far below, the red terracotta roofs of Fuller Hall spread out beneath the last rays of sun. Beside her, her roommate and childhood friend, Susan, leaned against the frame. You're a fine one to talk when you're not even dressed. Be honest now. Are you more excited to go to the party with Matthew or be seen in that sports car of his? Talking of which, she pointed. There it is. Glancing down at the sleek green MG glinting against the grandeur of Table Mountain, Philippa gave a smile of relief as she stepped into the burnt orange, full-skirted evening dress her late mother had sewn for her, turning so that Susan could do up the zipper. You know, it wouldn't hurt to make him wait now and then, said Susan. He's always late. Matthew Myburgh is rich and entitled. He'll play with your heart and trample on it. Don't be ridiculous. Philippa's smile was brittle as she smoothed her sleek chignon and pulled on her elbow-length gloves. Matthew's approval mattered more than she cared to admit, especially to Susan, who always expressed such disdain for her new boyfriend. Boyfriend? Surely she could call him that after 5 weeks of exclusive dating. As this year's rag queen, Philippa was determined to prove she belonged in the glittering social world her mother had abandoned years ago. Well, your young man is here, Susan remarked, peering out of the window, though it seems Eliza has captured his attention. He hasn't even got out of the car. Philippa, your father's on the phone. A voice floated down from the corridor outside. Ignoring the sting of Susan's words, Philippa adjusted her dress, then stepped out onto the polished timber hallway, hurrying to pick up the dangling receiver of the communal telephone. Daddy, lovely to talk to you, she said, forcing a cheerful tone above the static. We're off to a 21st birthday. How are things in the mountains? Her father's role as district commissioner in Mokhotlong, the British Empire's remotest outpost at 10,000 feet amidst the rocky peaks of Basutoland, required a broad repertoire of skills. ranging from investigating illegal diamond buying to ritual medicine murders, so his answer was unlikely to be routine. "There's been another murder in the Kuthing district." Her father's voice crackled through the line, crisp and heavy. "The resident commissioner wants the preliminary report on my desk by next week, and then Stuart's flying me up to Letseng-la-Terai tomorrow. The miners were snowed in last week." "Stuart? The pilot?" Philippa felt a sudden, unexpected quickening in her chest. "I thought he went back to England." Her father chuckled softly down the line. "He returned to Maseru on the 1st. I recall you had quite the schoolgirl crush on him." "Oh, Daddy, I was 16. Philippa felt her cheeks burn at the memory of the taciturn English pilot with his angular jaw, piercing eyes, and lazy, amused smile. "Well?" her father continued, his tone softening. "I wondered if you'd thought about coming home for half-term. There's a seat on the Saturday flight from Maseru to Mokotlong. I know it's a long way from Cape Town, but I've been lonely, my girl." Philippa swallowed against the knot in her throat. She wanted to say yes, but Mrs. Myberg was hosting a tennis party next weekend, and an invitation to the family's sprawling Kenilworth mansion was the sign she'd been praying for. "I'm so sorry, Daddy, but Matthew is introducing me to his parents next weekend." She lied smoothly, hating herself for the deception. "I'll bring him home at Christmas instead." "Of course, darling. Have fun at your party." Hanging up the receiver, Philippa drew a steadying breath. She stepped outside into the evening breeze, where Frank, one of Matthew's rugby mates, waiting by his car, waved her over. "Matthew said he'd go back to his digs to get changed," Frank called out. "I'm to pass on the message that he'd meet us at the party, so I'll take you." Philippa was careful to hide her hurt. By the time Frank's car turned onto the jacaranda-lined avenue in front of the party, music was spilling into the street. The girls stepped out of the car, pinching colour into their cheeks and adding a fresh layer of lipstick before they went inside. Hopefully Matthew would be here soon, Philippa thought, as she moved through the crowded sitting room, accepting a glass of champagne and politely fending off admirers, keeping her eyes glued to the front door. An hour passed, then 2. She danced a little, drank perhaps too much. But when the clock in the hall struck 10, panic replaced her patience. "Looking for Matthew?" Tommy, a dark-haired physics student, asked as he passed. "I saw him upstairs a little while ago." Relief mixed with irritation. How had Matthew not found her the moment he arrived? Up the stairs, the Persian runner muted her kitten-heeled pumps as she trailed down the quiet hallway. Why hadn't Matthew come looking for her? The first bedroom door was locked, the second was empty. Near the end of the corridor, an alcove hid a half-open door to a third room. "Matthew," she whispered, pushing it open. In the dim light cast from the street lamp outside, she made out movement on the bed. A muffled shriek followed, a frantic scrambling of limbs and the rustle of skirts. "Sorry!" Hot with embarrassment, Philippa began to pull the door shut when a familiar, defensive wail stopped her cold. "It's not what you think, Philippa." Philippa's hand froze on the light switch. She clicked it on. The harsh glare exposed the bed. Susan sat upright, hurriedly smoothing her ruined chignon and pulling up the straps of her blue chiffon dress. Beside her, Matthew was scrambling to his feet, adjusting his trousers, his gaze sliding guiltily away from Philippa's face. "We weren't doing anything," Susan gabbled, her face flushed red. "Really?" "Philippa, wait!" Matthew stepped forward, reaching for her, his aftershave mixing sickeningly with the smell of Susan's perfume. Philippa jerked back as if burned. Tears stung her eyes, but the shock in her chest hardened into something icy and sharp. Susan, her closest friend, Matthew, the boy she had built all her golden dreams around. Silently, Philippa turned on her heel and walked out, her heels clicking against the floorboards as she ran down the stairs, hot tears spilling down her cheeks. "Philippa, is everything all right?" someone asked. She shook her head. "I want to go home," she whispered, sagging against the wall. "I'll take you," offered Tommy, his tone awkward, but kind as ever. Wait a minute while I ask Hugh for his keys. She tried to stifle her sobs while Tommy patted her shoulder, not knowing what to say until he drew up in front of Fuller Hall. Here you are, home safe, he said before he went round to open her car door. But home wasn't the varsity dorm she shared with Susan. No, as soon as she could, Philippa was taking that flight home to the stone bungalow at 10,000 feet in remote Basutoland, high in the mountains, where she belonged. Chapter 2. Letseng-la-Terai, diamond diggings. Circling vultures had led 2 herd boys to the body at the base of the ravine. Perilous, one of the oldest miners, regaled the crowd from the top of a boulder, shivering in the icy wind that howled through the Letseng-la-Terai diamond diggings. His cheeks grew pinker and his gestures more extravagant as his ragged listeners gasped at every grisly detail. Standing on the barren, frozen earth at 11,000 feet, Stuart gathered the victim had been mutilated, the familiar, chilling hallmarks of Diretlo, or medicine murder. He leaned across to Samuel, the young police trooper he'd just flown up from the lowlands. Kuthing district, that's the second in 3 weeks. A very bad business, Ra, Samuel confirmed, hoisting his provision box onto his shoulder. Tell the DC you heard it from me. A second murder was very bad business indeed. Only that morning, Stuart had collected District Commissioner Charles Tremain's preliminary report to deliver to the resident commissioner in Maseru. Mackenzie, Stuart shouted, catching sight of a grizzle-headed miner wrapped in a traditional, colourful blanket. We're leaving now. Last call for Mokotlong. Dark storm clouds were gathering with the speed of vultures to fresh carrion. Weather waited for no man, and Stuart couldn't afford to miss his window if he was to get airborne. Mackenzie ambled across the snow, a gap-toothed grin splitting his weathered face. He'd recently struck it rich on his 9-foot lease, trading sheep for sieving equipment that had finally thrown up a fortune. I think the captain is in a big hurry, Mackenzie teased slyly, as Stuart helped him buckle into the small Cessna. Perhaps to see a pretty lady, eh, Ray? Stuart snorted, stamping his feet against the biting cold. In truth, he was supposed to meet Lizzie Cameron at the Maseru Country Club at 6. She was sweet and kind, but their quiet courtship lacked the spark he'd always dreamed of. At 26, stuck in these remote mountains, trying to log the multi-engine hours he needed for a shot at the commercial airlines, Stuart was beginning to wonder if such passion existed outside film posters. Minutes later, the Cessna was airborne, climbing above the treeless, jagged peaks. Look, Ray! Philemon, Stuart's second passenger, pointed to a white streak in the high atmosphere. A very big plane, Morena. It was the jet contrail of a BOAC 707 tracking towards London. Stuart felt a familiar pang of envy. 4 years he'd spent in these mountains, eking out a living on the fringes, while other pilots moved on to proper airline careers. Big is better, Mackenzie declared from the back seat. With my diamond, I will buy peacocks instead of goats to make my wife happy. Do you have peacocks, Captain? If I had money, Moeketsi, I'd spend it on wiser investments than pretty birds. Stuart called back over the engine. Why do you not have a wife then, Captain? I have to find a diamond as big as yours before I can afford one. Stuart laughed. You do not need a diamond, Captain. You just need to fly the big plane. Then you can choose the prettiest wife in all of Basutoland. An hour later, the Cessna's tyres touched down on the short dirt strip at Mokotlong. Charles Tremain leaned on the wooden fence bordering his garden, smoking his pipe against a backdrop of black, brooding mountains. Cold as charity, eh? The district commissioner greeted as Stuart cut the engine. Dapper as always in his houndstooth jacket, Charles made Stuart feel shabby in his frayed collar and worn leather jacket. Is Philippa ready? Stuart asked, glancing anxiously at the bruised storm clouds creeping over the peaks. She won't be long, Charles said indulgently. My little girl's all grown up now. 2nd year at Cape Town University. She came home early for half-term, but she's not her usual bright self. I'm glad you had room to fly her down to Maseru. She wasn't looking forward to 7 hours in a Land Rover. Stuart, I haven't seen you in years. Stuart turned and froze. The gangly, entitled schoolgirl he used to fly to boarding school was gone. In her place stood a breathtaking, long-legged young woman with dark, lustrous hair, ivory skin, and striking violet eyes. She was smiling at him, stepping gracefully beside her father, while her old nanny, Francina, brought up the rear. Dabbing her eyes, Stuart blinked, momentarily struck dumb. She looked astonishingly like the Audrey Hepburn posters he'd admired as a teenager. "Philippa," he managed, feeling immensely awkward. "I've changed since you saw me last, haven't I?" She laughed, delighted by his surprise. "Just glad you had room for me. I wasn't looking forward to sitting next to Mrs. Lehman talking all the way down the Sani Pass." Feeling suddenly awkward, Stuart took her leather suitcase. "We must go before the weather closes in," he said abruptly, nodding at her father. Once they were airborne and had levelled off, Philippa turned in her seat, her dark eyes fixed on him. "I hear you've just been back to England." "My mother's funeral," she gasped. "I am so sorry. I hope you made it in time to see her." Stuart shrugged. It wouldn't have mattered either way. She wouldn't have appreciated the effort. It seemed she didn't know what to say to this, and Stuart didn't feel like breaking the silence. Finally, she said, "I know you're English, Fur. You don't sound very English to me. You sound like you've lived in southern Africa your whole life." The conversation was not going in a direction he liked. "My sister and I were evacuees in Pretoria during the war," Stuart replied guardedly, focusing on the instruments. The accent stuck. He wasn't about to tell her that this had in part been to the tireless efforts of his saviour, Mrs. Franklin, to erase the Cockney accents of his sister and himself. "Well, Daddy says you've done remarkably well considering how you—" Philippa stopped abruptly, seizing upon a newspaper tucked into the map pocket. The headline read, "Diamonds Stolen in Brazen Heist." She scanned it, frowning. "I hope Daddy didn't see this. It certainly doesn't reflect well on the administration, though I suppose Daddy has bigger worries with these dreadful medicine murders." "He hopes someone will finally speak up since Chief Thabo was acquitted for the second time," Stuart said. Then, with a smile, he added, "Your dad mentioned you're engaged. Or nearly." Philippa stiffened. The playful warmth vanished, and her eyes flashed as she said in a low voice, "I no longer have a boyfriend. I came home because I was betrayed." She bit her lip, turning her face toward the side window. "I ended it. You don't need to feel sorry for me." A heavy silence enveloped the cockpit. Before Stuart could find a diplomatic way to break it, the Cessna's engine gave a sudden, violent shudder. The roar of the engine sputtered, coughed, and died completely. An eerie, suffocating silence filled the cabin, broken only by the sharp whistle of wind against the aluminum airframe. Below them, a solid wall of dark, churning storm clouds blocked out the earth entirely. "Stuart!" Philippa's voice was a terrified whisper. She lunged across the narrow space, her hand clutching his leather sleeve with surprising force. A waft of Chanel No. 5 hit him, sharp and delicate, while her wide, panic-filled eyes searched his. "The engine! What's happening?" "Carburetor icing," Stuart said, his hands flying across the control panel as he pulled the heat control and switched fuel tanks. He wasn't faking. The high-altitude freezing air had choked the fuel mix. "Hold on." He pushed the nose down to maintain airspeed, gliding blind towards the solid grey blanket of clouds below. The engine sputtered once, caught, and roared back to life. But as they broke through the floor of the cloud deck, Stuart's heart sank into his throat. They weren't over the Maseru Plains. A wall of blinding, white-out rain and jagged, dark granite rose directly ahead of them. The storm had slammed shut the pass, trapping them in the high peaks with a dying engine and zero visibility. "Hang on!" Stuart shouted, hauling back on the yoke as the wind seized the tiny aircraft like a leaf in a gale.